We did a pretty straightforward installation of Active Directory directory services, and we easily promoted it to a domain controller. Now that we've created our forest, we can add another domain controller to it to provide redundancy. We can perform different types of installations. We can perform an installation using PowerShell. We can perform an installation from media. Maybe we want to perform an installation from the files that are stored in a network share. We can do that, and that's what we're going to discuss in this sub-lesson. Let's begin by taking a look at how to add a DC to existing domain. I kind of quickly pointed it out to you as I performed the installation in the previous sub-lesson. We're going to install ADDS on the server, just like we did before, and then we're going to promote it to a DC, but we're going to change it slightly from what we saw, because instead of saying I want to create a new forest, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to add another domain controller for redundancy to an existing forest. So we're going to choose that option, and then we're going to specify the fully qualified domain name of that domain. Now things will be different. It'll ask me about the installation of DNS on the server. It'll ask me about global catalog functionality for redundancy. It'll ask me whether or not I want to create this as an RODC. I couldn't do that in the first domain controller of my forest. We can then choose a site name from the list of sites that are provided, and then we'll of course supply our DSRM password. And then, because we now have multiple domain controllers, we get to determine how they're going to stay synchronized. We can't have different information on our domain controllers. So also choose our directory replication method. When adding another domain controller to an existing domain, or forest if you will, we have some other options available to us, and one of them is to create an RODC, or a read-only domain controller. Well, why would I want an RODC? Partially because it only hosts the domain portion of your directory. Remember, we had the domain, the configuration, and the schema. This is going to only host the domain portion, but this RODC does have some limitations. It can't host the FSMO roles, flexible single master operations. We'll talk about those in more detail in just a little while. We can't update or propagate changes. This is read-only, so we're not going to be able to make any changes or propagate any changes from this RODC. Why would I use this? Because I want a more secure copy of our Active Directory. So I would deploy this in less secure locations, and if I have a location with fewer IT procedures and minimal bandwidth. Because if we have minimal bandwidth, we don't want to be consumed by the Active Directory replication. The RODC must have access to a writable DC, and this writable DC has to be at least 2008 or higher. And it can be deployed in a couple different ways. A staged approach, where would someone with the ADDS domain administrator rights performs that first stage by creating an account in the directory for the RODC, and we can use that account to execute the installation in the second stage. Now compare that to a non-stage. We're going to see this shortly. We can use the same steps as adding a DC to an existing domain, but we're going to click Read-Only DC when we get to the options page, where we'll also work with our DNS, our global catalog server, our site name, and our DSRM information. So those are some characteristics of a read-only domain controller. We also have a way to install from media, IFM. I told you I like my alphabet soup. Why would I want to use IFM? Reduce network traffic for that initial replication. Remember, when I boot up a new DC, it needs to talk to an existing DC to get a copy of all its information. Or I'm going to configure multiple DCs, and I don't want all that replication, and I want to streamline the installation on these DCs. Or the DC has significant network latency issues. I'm in a remote area, and I don't want to consume all the network bandwidth. But a little gotcha. Even though I'm using IFM, I still need to be able to connect to an existing DC. Just let them know I'm out there. I need to create media for this installation to take place, and I need enough free space for the directory information as well as sysvol if I want to include that. I have to create this media from a writable DC, and the operating systems have to be exact. I can't create an IFM from Windows Server 2016 and deploy it on a Windows Server 2012. Steps to create your IFM are pretty straightforward. Log on to a writable source DC, open up a command prompt, type in the ntdsutil command, then type in activate instance ntds, and then we're going to type create full c:ifm, and we can specify if we want to create an RODC, a sysvol full, or a sysvol RODC type of domain controller. So we have some options when we create a domain controller using IFM media. After we create the media, we're going to follow these steps to add a DC to an existing domain. When we get to step 3, we're going to choose install from media. Again, we're going to see this shortly. In the path, we're going to browse to the top level folder of our media. We're going to click verify to validate our media. We're going to choose source server from the replicate from drop down option. We'll click next, and then we'll complete the remaining steps in adding a new DC to an existing domain. Let's step out to another image and take a look at adding a domain controller to an existing domain, exploring these new options that are available to us as an additional DC to an existing domain. As you can see here, I have two images. I have my Windows Server 2016 image and my Windows Server 2016-2 image. And we've already gone through the installation of a domain controller on the Windows Server 2016. But during the installation, I noticed a couple things I didn't like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what I did. I'm going to go into my PC or this PC. I'm going to go to Properties. And if you remember during the install, I had a humongous, goofy computer name. So what I did is I went in and I renamed it. Now, renaming a domain controller is slightly different in the sense when I click Change Settings and I click Change for the computer name, it's going to give me this dialog box right here saying, hold on, dude. If you do this right now, and this is the only domain controller in your domain controller is going to be temporarily unavailable to users and computers. And because this was a single domain controller domain and I don't have any users, I just clicked OK on this and I did my name change. And I wanted to show you that because I didn't like the names that we were going to use throughout the rest of the course. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel on this and bring us back to our domain controller that we had created initially. And notice now I'm on our Windows Server 2016-2 and I also changed the name over here. This is called AZMTP2, so it's a much more user-friendly name to work with. And now we want to add another domain controller and look at the options available when we add a domain controller to a forest or a domain. And when we added our first domain controller, we were able to utilize a wizard coming out of the ADDS, but we don't have that wizard anymore. So how do I get in there? Well, one way is we had this little yellow icon saying, dude, you have some unfinished business. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Oh yeah, you forgot to finish the promotion of this server to a domain controller. So this is as if we're picking up in the wizard that we used earlier. And you can see we have the options that we had before, but now we're going to add a domain controller to an existing domain. So we need to type in that domain, azmtp.pearson.com, and then we'll click select, and it's going to prompt me for credentials, domain administrative permissions, to ensure I can add this server as a domain controller. So I'm going to type in azmtp/administrator and then supply the password for that administrator. We'll go ahead and do an OK. Quickly found it, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that and do an OK. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And you'll see on this name we have a domain name service as an option. We have a global catalog server. Well, we already have one global catalog server, but don't forget about redundancy. So we're going to go ahead and leave this as a global catalog server as well. This is where I would click and make this a read-only domain controller, which means it only gets the domain partition of those 3 partitions from our domain controller that already exists out there. If I had created additional sites, maybe I have a site for Europe, I could actually drop down and put this domain controller in that specific site. I've not created any new sites, so we're going to leave this as the default first site name. And then we'll add the DSRM password. And we'll go ahead and click Next again. And it's giving us the same information about the DNS options. We'll click Next. And this is where I would specify I want to use IFM by clicking here and specifying the path. And there's that Verify button that we talked about. And the next option is who do I want to replicate the domain controller information from? Any domain controller, or I could choose a specific domain controller if I know one isn't as busy as some others. So we have that option as well. I'll choose any domain controller. We only have one anyway. Our default database, log files, and sysvol folders are here as well. And then we have our review option. Don't forget our very powerful view script option as well. We'll go ahead and click Next. It'll run through the prerequisite checker. And you'll see all the prerequisites are good, so we're ready to rock. And now we'll go ahead and click the Install button. And with the beauty of video, I'll be pausing this as this install completes. You'll see that the installation was successful and it's going to do a restart for me. After the restart, I logged in. I've opened up Server Manager. And let's verify the fact that we've joined the domain. I'm going to click Local Server. And notice here's my AZMTP2. And we're part of the azmtp.pearson.com. So we've gone through all the steps necessary to look at how to add an RODC. We also looked at how to create an IFM and use that for performing an installation. And we added another domain controller to our domain called azmtp.pearson.com. Well, as you can see, it's pretty straightforward for adding a domain controller to an existing domain, but you may want to use PowerShell to do so. Specifically, if you're running a Windows Server Core operating system, there's no GUI on there, so you're going to have to use PowerShell, and it's just a couple PowerShell commands to perform those two tasks. The first one is the install Windows feature, with the AD domain services as being the feature, and you'll want to use the include management tools to grab the management tools, and then import module ADDS deployment are the two commands you'll need to use for installing the ADDS using PowerShell. You can also use install-ADDS forest for promoting a server to the first domain controller in a forest. If you already have a forest, you can use the install-ADDS domain install, and that's going to create the first domain controller in a child or tree domain. Or you can use the install-ADDS domain controller install PowerShell command to add a domain controller to an existing domain, which are the steps that we just did in the GUI. If you're going to use the install-ADDS forest, it's going to prompt you for the safe mode administrator password if you don't supply that when you execute the install-ADDS forest command. And as we've talked about, you can create a PowerShell script of your installation using that view script option. Now, you may already have an existing operating system that you want to upgrade to. You can use these upgrade paths. Windows Server 2012 Standard, you can jump up to Standard or Data Center. If you're running 2012 Data Center, you obviously wouldn't want to downgrade to Standard in 2016, so it's Data Center to Data Center, 2012 to 2016. 2012 R2 Standard, again up to 2016 Standard or Data Center. And your 2012 R2 Data Center can go up to 2016 Data Center. And if you're running the Windows 2012 R2 Essentials, you can bring that up to Windows Server 2016 Essentials. So if you already have domain controllers out there, these are your upgrade paths. In addition to upgrading, you can actually clone a domain controller. This is great for virtual servers. The hypervisor must support what's called VM-Generation ID. Most later hypervisors do, including all the versions of Hyper-V since Windows 2012 and the VMware Sphere 5.1 and later. Source Virtual DC must be Server 2012 or higher to be cloned, and it must be also a member of the Clonable Domain Controllers group in ADDS. The domain controller owner of the PDC emulator FSMO role has to be on the network running Server 2012 or higher, and you'll have to use an XML file to clone, and you can configure those settings for the cloning in the DC clone config.xml file, and you can create this XML file using the new-ADDC clone config file. And this XML file will include network settings, DNS, WINS, the AD site name, the new DC name, as well as other parameters. In order for you to clone, you're going to need some PowerShell commandlets, specifically get-ADDC cloning excluded application list, which is going to list all the software running on the domain controller, which will be used to generate an XML file. And remember, the new ADDC clone config file creates the XML file. And as you can see, I included a command that includes the IPv4 address, your default gateway, your subnet mask, as well as your DNS server address. By default, this XML file is created in the NTDS folder, and then depending on the hypervisor software you're using, you'll want to follow the steps necessary to import that clone into your new virtual machine. So cloning is another way for you to create a domain controller. So now you know how to upgrade a server to a domain controller using a few different options, whether it being using Server Manager, creating an RODC, using IFM to deploy your Active Directory domain controller, or using cloning.